Okay, welcome to Lesson 3 in our unit on the Communist Manifesto. Here we introduce Marx's theory of the state, and we go one step deeper into the question of imperialism. We'll start out examining globalization, capitalism's tendency to spread all over the globe. We focus in on the possible effects this may have on the nation-state system. Then we move on to talk about what the state is, and we look at Max Weber's theory and then compare it to Marx's. Let's get started. So one question we're holding on to is whether capital necessitates imperialism. And another question I want to address is whether global capital will outmode the nation-state system. Here are two facts to start us off. One, global capital is increasing in power and decreasing in accountability. One example of this is that there are billions of pounds of unpaid taxes owed by large corporations, and the national authorities seem to have a dwindling ability or motivation to actually tax the rich. Actually, maybe it's not that they can't. There are good arguments to suggest that tax reform is possible, but it doesn't seem like that's the trend that the logic of capital is spearheading. It seems more like the state simply won't, right? The desire or the motivation isn't there. The second fact I want to point out right off the bat is that many giant multinational corporations have so much wealth that they dwarf the economies of entire nation states. And insofar as money is power, corporations are becoming more powerful than nation states. So Marxist international relations theory is really going to reject that the most powerful entities are the nation states and armies. Really, states are tools for global capital to expand, especially in an imperialist or a neo-colonial way. I need to preface this section by saying that I plan to do a much longer lesson on imperialism and colonialism. This is just a brief overview of some of Marx's remarks about this subject that he talks about in the manifesto. Okay, so how does imperialism work? And how does capital have a tendency to produce imperial dynamics? Well, if one corporation can enter into a new foreign market and corner that market, then it can grow. And if it can grow, it's in a better position to outcompete the rest. In a system of compete or die, grow or die, if just one corporation can become global, the rest must follow suit or be outcompeted and shut down. Let's read from the manifesto. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. Let's be clear about the double-edged tendency that Marx identifies in imperial capitalism. On the one hand, extensive expansion that we talked about last time, right, expanding past your national boundaries, tends to look like all the horrors every student of history is familiar with, right? Marx recognizes this, and in many instances throughout his life, he critiqued this kind of imperialism and journalistically documented its horrors. He thought it was horrific in many ways. He knew it was. On the other hand, Marx saw this process in another way, that capital was producing an interconnected, universal, modern world. It's my belief that Marx did see this general tendency towards global interconnection, improved technology, and increased wealth as something that is generally good in a way, while at the same time he was ruthlessly critiquing some of the means by which this development took place. Whether or not that's a Eurocentric analysis is something I'll leave up to you to decide for now. We're going to talk more about this in this unit on the manifesto. Okay, we have to talk about the civilizing mission idea. This next quote explains how the state is involved in this process because states benefit if their companies grow. The bigger their economy, the more taxes they get, the more they can fund their police and militaries and so on. So on the one hand, Capitalism doesn't need the state. The cheap prices are enough to draw other countries into the capitalist fold. On the other hand, global capital absolutely does use the military arm of the state to open up other countries to their markets, which is what the opium wars in China were all about. Anyway, let's read. There's a lot of examples of that. Let's take a look. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst. That is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. What I think is key here is that this is a kind of subconscious domination. Capital doesn't have any evil supervillain behind it in the driver's seat. It has a self-expanding logic, and everyone is trying to keep up with it. This imperialist process is domination. It creates the world after its own image, which is the most perfect definition of domination I can think of. But this domination is cleverly concealed with a kind of ideology of a civilizing mission, right? These backward, unadvanced barbarian nations should count their lucky stars to be allowed into the capitalist fold and have access to the West's commodities. Today we talk about the exporting of liberalism and democracy to the underdeveloped or the third world or the periphery or whatever, when Marxists remind us that liberalism is capitalism, and capitalism needs to expand. So the West isn't doing this just because it has a narcissistic self-image and wants everyone to be like the West because of the universal values it holds. That's part of it. But underneath that is a material reality. Marx is teaching us this is material, economic expansionist imperatives at play. So Marx tells us a story about the international expansion of capital, and the question arises, will capitalism and its tendencies for globalization or extensive expansion outmode the nation-state system in the same way that the forces of production outmode the relations of production? Let's read what he says about extensive expansion. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. Okay, Marx is establishing that capital has a tendency to expand past national boundaries. Next, national differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. Okay, this should remind us of the double-edged sword. On one hand, there's a level of modernity and cosmopolitanism and wealth that we might respect. On the other hand, we're talking about the destruction of culture. We're talking about genocide, right? Or at least the destruction of nationality. Perhaps there is a way to have wealth and modernity while preserving culture, but not nations. If you're like me, nations, especially nation states, are something we want to get rid of eventually, right? We're internationalists. So the project is to find out how to destroy nations without sacrificing culture. Speaking to one of the most significant positive aspects of capitalism's tendencies to grow and then destroy itself, Marx also claims it has a tendency to end international hostility and war. How? Well, First, capital eliminates national distinctions through globalization. Hopefully, this is a process that can be done without destroying the non-oppressive aspects of indigenous cultures. This process is synonymous with a unified global proletariat whose interests are aligned in a single class. Then a global revolution in at least the major countries would eliminate international hostility because all nations would be run by one unified working class without any exploitative dynamics. Let's read. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them, nations, to vanish still faster. United international action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another will also be put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. So that's Marx's argument. As capital becomes global and through that process it begins to overcome itself, the nation-state system and all the wars that are caused by it will come to fade. Now let's talk about an argument from Ellen Wood, who explains that before capitalism outmodes itself through the globalization process, it's likely to strengthen and embolden nationalisms around the world. She writes, although the world today is more than ever before a world of nation-states, we are constantly being told that the global expansion of capitalism has ruptured its historic association with the nation-state. The state, we're assured, is being pushed aside by globalization and transnational forces. But while no one would deny the global reach of capital, there is little evidence that today's global capital is less in need of national states than were earlier capitalist interests. Global capital, no less than national capital, relies on nation-states to maintain local conditions favorable to accumulation, as well as to help it navigate the global economy. It might then be more accurate to say that globalization is characterized less by the decline of the nation-state than by a growing contradiction between the global scope of capital and its persistent need for more local and national forms of extra economic support, a growing disparity between its economic reach and its political grasp. Let's continue with some more textual hiking from Wood. In fact, capitalism, in some ways more than any other social system, needs politically organized and legally defined stability, regularity, and predictability in social arrangements. Yet, these are conditions of capital's existence and self-reproduction that it cannot provide for itself, and that its own inherently anarchic laws of motion constantly subvert. To stabilize its constitutive social relations between capital and labor, or capital and other capitals, capitalism is especially reliant on legally defined and politically authorized regularities. Business transactions at every level require consistency and reliable enforcement in contractual relations, monetary standards, exchanges of property. The coercions that sustain these regularities must exist apart from capital's own powers of appropriation if it is to preserve its capacity for self-expansion. Okay, what's the take-home point here? In a word, capitalism needs state coercion. In fact, Marx understood this very well. It's embedded in Marx's theory of the state. Okay, what is the state? The political theorist Max Weber gives us this definition. The state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So we have here a territorially bounded system of laws backed up by the threat or use of force. And whoever can gain legitimacy to claim the authority to use this force gets to be the state. But how is the violence inherent in the state used? In whose interests? Marx gives us a deeper answer. He says, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So the theory here is that the state is nothing but the tool for the ruling class. In future classes, I want to go far deeper into Marx's theories of the state, but for now we're just giving a foundational understanding. Okay, let's lay down Marx's theory of the state. It starts with the question, in whose interests does the state act? Premise 1. The interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are opposed, right? It's a zero-sum game, at least in a lot of ways. Premise 2. Therefore, the actions that the state takes must favor one class or the other. Premise 3. The state favors the interests of the bourgeoisie because it's primarily the bourgeoisie that funds candidates. Conclusion, the state is an instrument of the bourgeoisie. All right, simple enough. There is a counter-argument here that I think adds to this picture without really refuting it. The idea is that premise 1 is dubious. Sometimes the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are aligned. For example, taxation to pay for good schools. Workers benefit from being smarter. Capitalists benefit from having a competent labor market. Remember, without this state staving off laissez-faire capitalism, capitalism would self-destruct in 5 seconds. Remember that the naked power of dictatorships are unstable and predisposed to revolutionary action. It's a lot more effective to have a Bill of Rights and a semblance of democracy, obviously not a real democracy, but that's a lot more pacifying. It maintains control much more efficiently, right? So some kind of a welfare state that keeps people pacified and meets a semblance of their basic needs or something like that is going to stabilize capitalism, and that's really good for capitalism, and it's also kind of good for the people. But it's still capitalism, right? There's still an exploitative dynamic at play. Okay, so there are 2 major questions I want to leave you with at the end of this lesson. The first concerns capitalism's need to expand. It does need to expand, but does capitalism require imperialism to expand? Or could it expand intensively, right, within national boundaries? Further, insofar as it does expand extensively and go global, could it be done without imperial dynamics? Could it be done consensually? Another way of framing this question is whether imperialism is part of the logic or being of capitalism, or is imperialism just a part of the becoming or the history and present of capitalism? These terms being and becoming are something we introduced in the last lesson, so go back and check that out if you want a little refresher. But we're going to continue to be talking about and bringing this question up throughout this unit on the manifesto. The second question I'll leave you with is how to understand capitalism's relationship with the state. How do we understand this contradiction between capitalism's tendencies to expand and globalize past national boundaries, but at the same time, it has a real reliance on the state to oppress workers and keep them in line in their home countries and abroad? Addressing these questions will be key to understanding revolutionary strategy, which is the subject of the next lesson. Thank you for joining me. Stay tuned. We can go deeper then.